I think it's very important that we try to discuss out some of what the defeat of US imperialism, US and British imperialism in Afghanistan actually means. And I think that's the first and foremost thing to say, is that this is something that should be really welcomed by progressive forces all around the world. The defeat of US imperialism, the defeat of British imperialism is a very, very positive thing. And this is a very historic moment that I want to sort of talk about, sort of how significant it is. But I think it's also very important for us to try, and what I want to try and do is go over some of the lessons of the war, challenge some of the lies and propaganda that we use to justify the war, because I think unless we do that, those people who are still defending the decision to go to war in Afghanistan and engage in this atrocious and unjust war will try to claw back that position by presenting themselves as the defenders of the Afghan people, by presenting themselves as the people who are defending women's rights in Afghanistan. So I think that's why it's important to go over it. But I think I also want to try and look at how the defeat came about, so the recent history of Afghanistan and what that means for the Afghan people today, but also for people like ourselves, socialists in the imperialist countries, and what we should be saying about it and what happens from now. I think the thing to say is that the coverage of the collapse of the US and British-backed puppet regime in Afghanistan over the last week has just been dominated by the most awful hypocrisy and lies. From all the front pages of the newspapers, from the television coverage, the debates in Parliament, sort of the Tory MPs and the front bench of the Labour Party, all have joined in this chorus of saying that Joe Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan, has been an absolute disaster. Will set everything back and has thrown away all the supposed gains of the war of the last 20 years. Boris Johnson, for example, sort of stood up in Parliament, said he was extremely proud of what Britain's role had been in Afghanistan since the Western invasion in 2001. Keir Starmer echoed this by saying how proud he was of the role of the country and regrets the decision of the US to pull out troops. And I think what I want to argue tonight is that all of this, sort of concern for the people of Afghanistan, and especially Afghan women, has been completely missing for most of the last 20 years. When massacres and outrages and bombings of civilians, tens of thousands of civilians, never mind sort of fighters and combatants and soldiers and so on, have been killed in this war. An estimated 250,000 people killed altogether in the last 20 years. But all of that was missing. I mean, you might remember, and I was just recalling it today, when Prince Harry was interviewed about his time in Afghanistan and how he boasted about how he killed people with a machine gun from a helicopter flying over the countryside of Helmand province. And not a word was said about this at that time. Not a word of concern for those people. Were they innocent, or were they, or what were they? So all of this is all a very recent. It's all a very recent thing. I want to say that all this is an attempt, I think, to cover up for the role that they played. I mean, Tony Blair's article at the weekend, sort of with not a word of regret for the role that he played in justifying the US invasion of Afghanistan, subsequently sending enormous numbers of British troops there in order to back it up, and instead just repeating all the lies about the danger and the threat of Islam that Islam poses to the West, and the need for ongoing intervention. And I think all of the stuff that we are hearing in the media, all the stuff that dominates the discussion about the collapse of the regime in Afghanistan, is really an attempt to find an alibi for an atrocious and unjust war. I think the first thing to say is that this really is an enormous and historic defeat for US imperialism and for its junior partner, Britain. I think people are absolutely right, much as the US and British ruling class want to reject it, are absolutely right to point to the parallel with the helicopters lifting people off the roof of the US embassy in Saigon in 1975 when the US was defeated in the Vietnam War. That was an incredibly significant defeat for US imperialism in 1975. It was another 15 years before the US could even begin to think about intervening militarily elsewhere in the world. Right throughout the 1970s, the US was forced to rely on proxies like the Contras in Nicaragua and so on to back up dictatorships. But direct military intervention was something that was just completely unacceptable right up until the US invasion of Grenada, very minor skirmishes in 1983, and so on, right up until the Gulf War of 1991. And I think the significance of this defeat for the US military is even more important. I think it'll be even longer before any US government can seriously countenance a massive military invasion of this sort of scale. This sort of scale again. Why did the war come about? I think it's important to say that it was first and foremost an imperialist war, and a war that was driven by economic and military and strategic interests. The immediate the trigger for the war was the attacks in 9/11 in New York on the World Trade Center. But the idea of US military intervention throughout the Middle East and across that region had been in gestation for quite some time before that. The key advisors around the Bush administration in the United States, for example, who went by the name of the Project for a New American Century, the people like Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and so on, all of those strategic thinkers and so on, understood that crucially, the US was still the dominant military power in the world, but its economic power was eroding and being challenged by the rise of other economic players like China. Their strategy and their thinking was that because the US was still militarily dominant in the world, by far and away the biggest military machine in the world, that it could make up for and try to head off the economic and political challenge posed by countries like China by imposing itself militarily throughout the Middle East, controlling that key strategic region, which I control the majority of the world's oil supplies, and in that way provide a bulwark against the expansion of Chinese military and strategic and political power. This was their thinking. At the time, their key focus was on invading Iraq, which it saw as the key country that it wanted to invade. There was an enormous debate that went on immediately after 9/11, where Rumsfeld and people like that said, now is the time, we must strike while the iron's hot and invade Iraq. But there was a difficulty there that they couldn't find a justification for going into Iraq. And the reason Afghanistan was invaded was because it could be more closely associated with the forces that had carried out the 9/11 attack. It wasn't the most direct one, of course. Saudi Arabia was the country in which most of the 9/11 attackers were based in. But Saudi Arabia was a key US and British ally in the region. But the argument that Islamist terrorist forces could find a safe haven in Afghanistan was the one that was picked up on in order to provide the initial justification for US military action in the region. And it has to be said here that Tony Blair, who we all know played that junior partner to George Bush, promising that he would be there as soon as the shooting started and so on, provided a very, very key ideological justification for the initial use of US military power in this way. It was only after the invasion of Afghanistan it happened, justified at the time, of course, by all this talk about saving and rescuing Afghan women from the backwardness of the Taliban of the Taliban regime and so on. It was only after that had been established that then the build up to war in Iraq happened, all the myths about weapons of mass destruction and so on. This has been a disastrous strategy for the US and Britain. It has to be said. You compare what Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and these sorts of fanatics said at the time. What they said was, because of the overwhelming military superiority of the US, they would be able to go into countries like Afghanistan, overwhelm the government, set up a new regime, and leave what they called a small military footprint behind just to keep that regime intact. They said they would do this in Afghanistan, then they would go to Iraq and do exactly the same, a massive military invasion, and then most of the troops could be pulled out and a few thousand left to support the regime and so on. The opposite has been the case. Instead, the US and Britain have been dragged into wars that have lasted for decades, that have absorbed millions and millions of dollars in resources, cost countless thousands of lives, bogged the US military down in the regions, completely the opposite of what they imagined. And the end result has been a defeat, the same as Vietnam, a defeat at the hands of barely equipped. I mean, the Taliban didn't even own any helicopters, never mind anything else, running around in pickup trucks, wearing sandals and carrying rifles. A force like that humiliated the biggest military force on earth. And it has to be said that just how significant that is. It has to be said, though, the question of why this has happened just at the moment. Joe Biden it's very interesting to hear the way he justifies it. I think Biden is reflecting the part of the argument that has gone on in the US establishment and military circles as the realization of this quagmire has emerged, as a realization of this disaster and this defeat has emerged. Biden, for example, and it has to be said that, you know, George W. Bush started the war and threw 30,000 troops into Afghanistan. Barack Obama, who tragically, most of the US anti-war movement that had emerged against the Iraq and Afghanistan war, most of the US anti-war movement threw their weight behind Obama, seeing him as a more progressive force and so on. Obama increased the number of troops in Afghanistan to 100,000, and this, you know, trying to, and what he said was going to be a surge that would ultimately defeat the Taliban and the resistance to the US occupation. Joe Biden, when he was vice president under Obama, opposed that surge. He said that it was risky and it would bog America down if it tried to engage in a nation-building process. And this is what he is saying now. He's sort of representing and articulating that wing of the U.S. military understands how costly it has been, that they can't win, that they're being defeated, and that they need to withdraw before it gets even worse. But it has to be said, and it's very interesting and significant, I think, that part of Donald Trump's appeal was also to say that he wanted to withdraw from foreign wars, that foreign wars had bogged the US military down, and what was the point in it anyway, and why were we wasting all this money? And I think what both of them are responding to, and a few commentators have picked up on it very well, and it's important for us to see this, is that there might be that thinking going on about American military and strategic interests happening in Washington. But on the ground in working class communities right across America, the tens of thousands of people who've been killed, injured, maimed, and so on came from working class, poor areas of the United States. And those people have turned decisively against the war. For example, in 2001, right after the 9/11 attacks, polls were showing that 85 and 90% of Americans approved the invasion of Afghanistan. Last month, 62% of Americans approved of Biden's plan for total withdrawal, and only 29% were opposed. So the mood of working class communities, Black, white, Latino, and so on, has moved decisively against the war, and is trying to find expression for that. And I think Biden's decision is popular because of that, and it's a recognition. It's also a recognition of that reality. I mean, the sheer numbers are incredible. terrible. I mean, overwhelmingly the casualties have been in Afghanistan. But you just think of the numbers of US troops that were sent into war, never mind the number of them private contractors as well that were thrown into war. Over 800,000 US soldiers served. 100,000 British soldiers were thrown into the war. Thousands killed and injured, and so on, at an enormous price. So that's what's been going on in terms of the strategic decisions about the war. And I think it's important for us, first and foremost, to recognize this is an enormous military defeat for the US, and something that should be celebrated. How have the Taliban come back into power, though? They seem to be completely wiped out immediately after the invasion, a ragtag sort of army with very little resources. In saying this and explaining this, I think it's important to just go back slightly in Afghanistan's history. Afghanistan, for most of its history, has been a very peasant, agricultural, sort of very undeveloped country, right up until the 1970s. 95% of the population were peasants living off the land in a very poor country. Outside of Africa, the poorest country in the whole of the world. For all of that time, Pakistan was really run and dominated by big landowners called the Khans, who ruled, and with a very weak central state that could only rule through sort of those Khans and landowners that desperately exploited the peasantry in that country. In the 1960s and the 1970s, it was the emergence of a progressive movement amongst sort of students and the middle class in Kabul, the capital, and also amongst the sort of middling layer of peasants in the countryside, which sought to challenge the corruption of this rule. And they were very influenced by the Stalinist ideas, the Communist Party, and so on. But what they argued was that they wanted to see the development of Afghan society, that it become a modern society, and so on. They wanted to have a fair distribution of the land and justice for the peasants, and also equality for women, and a whole series of progressive ideas. They built a national movement around this, but the way in which they took power eventually from the government was that they said there's no big working class, no big organized working class, a largely peasant society in Afghanistan. And instead, it was a layer of young army officers influenced by this massive movement who took power in a coup that was initially very popular. There's a very popular movement at the time. But they'd taken power in the cities and taken the government, but they hadn't convinced the countryside. And the people who were around the big landowners became warlords and so on, began to challenge this government. The only way this progressive government could impose its rule was by using military force, by arrests, by detention, by shooting their opponents, by launching, by engaging in a civil war that they very quickly were finding that they were losing, and were very isolated in Kabul. In response to this government had been supported by the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan has the misfortune of being always on in a region where tensions between big imperialist powers have always been played out. The Soviet Union was trying to nurture relations with that government in order to increase its influence in the region, and it therefore was called in and went in and invaded, imposed its own sort of person, but basically propped up that new regime. And unfortunately, the people who were the progressives, the young radical students, who very bravely stood up and resisted the Khans and the old corrupt landowners, and so the young women who are influenced by feminist ideas, allied themselves with the Soviet occupation, an occupation which led to the death of between 500,000 and 1 million Afghans, and the injuring of tens of thousands more, and was enormously unpopular, and was met with a civil war led by Islamist movements, dominated by the Mujahideen and so on. And it's important, I think, to say this, because there is an argument on the left that the Mujahideen and later on the Taliban were simply the creation of U.S. imperialism in order to fight against the Soviet Union and overthrow that progressive government. Now, there's no doubt that the US, MI6, the CIA, and so on, did play, and they were explicit about the role they played in going in and financially and militarily supporting the Mujahideen groups, and later on, helping the creation of the Taliban in the refugee camps in Pakistan, and so on. Very, very explicitly went in, armed with $70 million worth of money to bribe, sort of local warlords and so on, in order to set these up. But it is important for us to understand that the reason why the Taliban had a purchase and the Mujahideen had a purchase was because they were fighting and resisting a very, very murderous occupation, an occupation that, we think the last 20 years has been bad. The Soviet occupation was enormously, at least killed at least twice as many people, if not more. And it was the fact that they were resisting that occupation that gave them some purchase, that gave them some popularity. The Soviet occupation was defeated, just like the American occupation had been defeated, which was a good thing and led to the unraveling of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in 1989. It was a key thing that exposed the weakness of the Russian government in 1989. And it was after that, then, the US's relationship to the Taliban constantly shifted and changed. For a time, they saw the Taliban as potential allies in forcing through an oil pipeline that would come through from the former Soviet states down into the South China Sea, and so on. But at other times, sort of withdrew their funding and withdrew their support, and those sorts of things. But I think it's important to put the Taliban in that sort of context, because it's important to see what happened then after the invasion. In the invasion in 2001. There was hardly any resistance to the US occupation for about 3 or 4 years. There was a deal done between the Taliban and the US, something that was not publicized at the time, but a backroom deal done, that the Taliban would withdraw to the refugee camps in Pakistan, go quietly back to their villages, and as long as they didn't openly resist the occupation, they would be left alone. But it was the sheer brutality and corruption of the US and British occupation that led to the re-emergence of the Taliban as a serious force. The US occupation allied itself with the corrupt warlords who had previously fought the Soviet occupation, paid them enormous amounts of money in bribes and so on. And it was the Taliban who emerged as the people who were against this corruption and also against the occupation. And I think it has to be said that the Taliban are a right-wing conservative force that we have to see do not have progressive ideas, see themselves as anti-socialist and anti-communist, and sort of, as I said, socialism and feminism and those progressive ideas discredited themselves by allying themselves with the Soviet occupation. That's really in a really tragic way. But we have to also see that what the Taliban are doing now, and part of their appeal now, is to say to the masses of people in Afghanistan, we are the people who will stand up for the poor. We are the people who will not be corrupted. We are the people who are against the occupation that has wreaked havoc on our country. And you can see the way in which the Taliban, somebody has described them as the Taliban Mark II. You can see that there's some shifts in the way in which the Taliban are operating. They are promising, whether it's true or not, but they're promising that there won't be revenge massacres for anybody who was associated with the occupation. They have been negotiating with the US in through Doha for the last 14 years. There's a layer of them that are skilled negotiators that are gone through that similar development that has happened to loads of other resistance movements in the world, where they develop a skill in diplomacy. They're looking to Pakistan, they're looking to China and the deals that they can do with China for aid and so on. They're taking a much longer term view. There are consequences and there are dilemmas for the Taliban if they were simply to be the way in which they were, the way in which they operated 20 years ago, and the Taliban know this themselves. So the things are in a state of flux. But I'm saying that in terms of challenging a notion that the Taliban and Islamist movements in the Middle East are simply the creation of the US. Though actually, we have to see that those movements are also the creation of years of war, 43 years of war now in Afghanistan, the experience of the refugee camps. The Taliban emerged out of the free madrasa schools that were set up in the huge refugee camps in Pakistan of people who fled the Soviet invasion. Talib just means the students. They were seen as the young, incorruptible Islamist students. That's where they emerged from. They emerged from years of occupation, and they're a very modern movement, not simply a medieval backward thing. Because I think it's important to say that in order to challenge the Islamophobia that has been such a feature of the war since 2001, and which is still repeated by people like people like Tony Blair. I'm sure I don't have much more time left, but I just want to sort of finish with on the question of the position of Afghan women, because I think this is a really key question for us. The situation of women in Afghanistan historically has been awful. The backwardness of peasant life has led to, you know, sort of the deeply conservative traditions of women not being encouraged to live outside the home and so on. And the Taliban, in some ways, expresses that nostalgia for the old days when strict Islamic rule kept everything in place. However, women in Afghanistan themselves have been part and parcel of fighting for more rights, fighting for their own education. And it's such a myth to believe that the liberation of Afghan women can be delivered, by dropping bombs from 15,000 feet from their skies. In the way that Laura Bush, George Bush's wife, and Sherry Blair sort of said at the time of the invasion, as sort of saying that this was what the purpose of the occupation was. You know, I think John Newsinger has quoted a senior British intelligence officer who put it that the point of arguing about women's rights to justify the invasion was, he said, it was always helpful for governments who want to get the Guardian readers of the world on board to have a humanitarian logic. And that really is the cynicism of the military strategists in Britain and the ruling class in Britain, that is what the way in which they use it. And I think that's the way we have to see it, and look to sort of women like Malala Joya, somebody who was elected as an MP to the Afghan parliament, that was set up, a sort of puppet parliament that was set up, but they had to put on a show of democracy, but who was elected there, but who faced death threats from the very same warlords who were being relied upon and being bought off by the US and Britain, and people who were every bit as conservative when it came to women, when it came to the education of women, and so on, as the Taliban were. It's those women and movements among those women that will deliver liberation, or provides the hope for liberation and equality among Afghan women. And Malala Joya, I think, and people like her, very rightly sort of says, first and foremost, the problem with Afghan women face is the US and British occupation, then the warlords, and then the Taliban. And it's fighting all of those things, or trying to create movements that challenge all of those things that provides the hope, that provides the hope. I'll finish just on this. Just the reason why things collapse so quickly in the last couple of weeks is a measure of the sheer scale of the corruption that underpinned the regime that the US and Britain were propping up. It's estimated that out of the 350,000 troops in the new Afghan army, between 100,000 and 200,000 of them just simply didn't exist. Instead, their wages were just paid and siphoned off by the local commanders as a form of corruption. In Kandahar, for example, officially there was supposed to be 10,000 police in Kandahar. In fact, and one estimate puts it, said there was just around 900 police. The rest, all their wages, all the resources were paid and siphoned off to the local commanders. Billions of pounds siphoned to aid organizations, to the local warlords, and so on, siphoned out of the country, put in Swiss bank accounts into the Gulf states, and all those sorts of things, and an absolutely staggering level of corruption. And this is why, when the US withdrew, the Afghan army, the Afghan police simply melted away. and they just had no ability no ability to fight. One last thing, I want to finish on then sort of lessons for us. The point is that imperialism, and perhaps I should have said this earlier on, but coming back to the question of what imperialism is a worldwide system of competing states, and in which the big financial and the big corporations of each state fuses in its interests with the military of different states, and they compete to divide up the world. They compete to divide up various spheres of influence, of economic influence, economic dominance, and all those sorts of things. That's what this period is. And this stage of capitalism is a stage when that military and economic interest are fused together. This is an enormous setback for US imperialism. It will mean an enormous gain, and this will lead to an enormous threat to US imperialism, enormous gains for China in particular, but also for Russia, that still has a massive military, and so on, and is constantly, as we see in Syria, trying to compete for influence and trying to shift against US dominance of the Middle East. So this is an enormously risky and unstable, where I think we're entering a period of enormous instability. In terms of that, the potential for proxy wars to sort of lead to even greater conflicts between those big imperialist powers, all of it underpinned by economic uncertainty and economic recession, and then economic competition between those different states. But it is a good thing that the US has had its wings clipped, that it has been pushed back, that is in a period of retreat, and will be less able to use that start military rule. It also has to reveal the nature of imperialism and what it means in the imperialist countries themselves. It's shocking that the amount of money that the estimates about how much the war cost in Britain, for example. Some put the estimates between 27 billion and 40 billion. And that works out at 15 million pounds a day. At a time, and as we all know, for the last 10 years, we've been living through cuts in every single public and social service that we can think of. Do you know what I mean? The cost of funding 15 primary schools for a year every single day. So that cost also corrupts what is happening in the imperialist country itself. It leads to the dominance of anti-refugee rhetoric, Islamophobic rhetoric, and so on. Sort of governments in the West who have been sending deportation flights back to Afghanistan now for the last 5-10 years, like the German government, the British government, and so on, and who now have to suddenly retreat and say that they're on the side of Afghan refugees, but only on the most minimal basis. I was speaking to an immigration lawyer last week, who's a friend of ours. But the British government, while promising that it's going to bring 5,000 Afghan refugees to Britain, for the 3,000 Afghan refugees who are currently in the asylum process here, all of their appeals have been stopped and delayed and postponed indefinitely, because the British government knows that if an Afghan refugee was to go in front of an appeal tribunal, their case would win hands down now. They don't want that to happen. They want to wait for the smoke to clear so that they can continue to persecute those people, make it difficult for them to come, and so on. And I think part of our argument here is to sort of talk about what socialists need to do is to talk about not just the monstrosity of the war, the lies that were used to justify it, the sense of priority about the billions that went into the war at the time when everything else is cut, but also to challenge that anti-refugee, that Islamophobic, racist sort of language, and make demands that not only that there should be no more wars like this ever again, and we need to build a strong anti-war movement, but also that we should welcome every refugee who wants to come here from the disastrous wars that Britain has been involved in.